Welcome, Ecom Logistics Nation. Thank you for joining today's episode. We're on a mission to share e-commerce logistics insights, trends, successes, and challenges from the leaders and innovators in our space.
So much had changed over the last 5 or 10 years. So many new innovations had happened, but we were still doing packaging and fulfillment the same way that it was done 25 years ago, 20 years ago. So I was like, okay, it's time for a reimagination, a better solution.
Welcome, Ecom Logistics Nation. Nanad and I are excited to welcome George Wojciechowski, CEO of e-commerce fulfillment provider Manifest. Love his story. Prior to launching Manifest, George co-founded ShipBob, which recently was valued at $1 billion, gaining unicorn status. Certainly a household name in the e-com fulfillment space. And before ShipBob, he had several roles in the investment community, including Goldman Sachs, and in the venture capital space. He's on a mission we're really passionate about, tackling the sustainability problems in e-commerce logistics while at the same time providing brands and merchants a better client experience. So many interesting topics to tackle and excited for the conversation. George, it's an absolute pleasure to have you and welcome my friend to the Ecom Logistics Podcast.
Thank you, Dan. It's a honor and a pleasure to be here as well. Super excited to get into the conversation with you and Nanad and see what we can where this goes.
Love it. Love it. George, you have a really interesting background, so would love to start with your story, your journey, and what inspired you to not only be a one-time founder in the e-commerce logistics space, which certainly isn't a space for the faint of heart, so a two-time founder in the space. Would love just to hear your background, your story, and your journey there.
He didn't learn the lesson. That's what it is.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And I did learn the lesson, but against my better judgment, I couldn't sit idly by knowing that the problem of lack of environmentally friendly practices in the fulfillment industry was something that I and my team could address. But thanks, Dan. Well, I was born here in Chicago, went to DePaul University. First 8 or so years of my career, I was in the trading and financial services industry. Initially, I started off as a runner on the Chicago Board of Trade back when being a runner was an opportunity that was given to young people who, showed initiative and hustle. And, you'd find somebody with a trading badge that would take a chance on you and give you an opportunity to prove yourself. And for me, it was one of the most fundamental learning experiences of my young career. It taught me a lot about responsibility and having a plan and sticking to it. One of the things that you learn very quickly in trading is the people that are always chasing the market or chasing the trends are the ones that don't have long-term. They don't sustain for a very long period of time. It's the people who have a plan and stick to their plan and their discipline that seem to have had careers that lasted 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And then in 2009, I transitioned from the trading industry to raising money for alternative energy and clean energy projects. I worked for a boutique investment bank here in Chicago that my big marquee project was raising about $80 million at that time for a company called Fisker Automotive. And Fisker Automotive, if anyone remembers, before its current iteration was the original Tesla. And at that point in time in history, it was even cooler than the Tesla. It was this a beautiful vehicle designed by Henrik Fisker, who made some of the most iconic cars of the late 20th century, early 21st century, and on an electric powertrain, fantastic performance. And that company, I was super excited about it. I was all in. And then a series of unfortunate events led to that company being derailed for about 10 years. And I think it's been rebooted and it is, again, a company that's producing and selling cars. But did that for a couple of years. There was a lot of, aside from Fisker, I raised money for Bloom Energy, which is also today a really successful company. It took some time. We thought that technology back in 2010, 2011 was going to just take over the world overnight. But now Bloom Energy is a public company and doing fantastically. And then also a lot of alternative fuels companies as well. Bright Source Energy, which was a big solar project in the Nevada desert, was also a big project that I spent a lot of time on.
So I guess after the financial services, you started ShipBob, or you got involved with ShipBob, and how was that journey, right? We know that there is a couple founders, if I'm not mistaken, with ShipBob. So if you can tell us a little bit about How did that journey go? How did it start? What did you guys do? It's intriguing. I think people would want to know.
Yeah, of course. ShipBob was the most amazing period of my life. I joined the company shortly after we came out of Y Combinator in the summer of 2014. Our goal was to give the new generation of e-commerce merchants the same tools, reach, scalability as the biggest players in e-commerce. I know you guys remember 2014. E-commerce at that point was dominated by large companies that could afford to have multiple distribution centers, large warehouses. And there was this trend popping up in e-commerce where, because of platforms like Shopify and BigCommerce and Squarespace, because they allowed anybody with an inspired idea for a product to get a respectable website and a payment gateway set up within 2 hours, was creating a whole new market of merchants that were now online and selling goods. But these merchants didn't have the same ability to invest in infrastructure, in warehousing, in employees, in insurance, in forklifts, and all this other stuff. And so that's where we saw an opportunity in ShipBob to provide these merchants, which traditionally was viewed by the traditional 3PL industry as, cookie crumbs compared to the businesses that they were used to servicing. The traditional 3PL model is maybe working with 12, 15 merchants and onboarding 1 or 2 merchants a quarter. Now, all of a sudden, you had all these smaller merchants with a really high velocity for growth, but larger 3PLs didn't necessarily want to take them on because they wanted to focus on their legacy clients and verified business that they knew that they could book over and over and over and over again. So that presented an opportunity for us to ShipBob to frame a solution for this new generation of e-commerce merchants. And we first infused tech into the value proposition. That was something that hadn't really been done before. A lot of the 3PLs that we had spoke with and viewed at the time were using software that looked like it was from 1997. So we created our own WMS from scratch, created a beautiful user interface that was focused on integrating with other tools, platforms, services, and marketplaces that the modern e-commerce merchant at that time was looking to connect to basically run the tech stack for their store. Our bet was that these cookie crumbs would add up to be a pretty sizable cookie. And as we all know, early generation of e-commerce merchants from that 2014, 2015, 2016 era, many of them are the leaders in this space today and are large businesses backed by private equity or venture capital and are brand names to a lot of people with the products that they sell.
And I mean, you talk about 2014, right? Just come to realize that was a long time ago at this point. But all the things that ended up happening, right, at that time. So you talk about everything was the Uber off, right? Or everything was the Airbnb off, or the conversations around, do you know who's the largest, hotel provider in the world? It's Airbnb. They don't even have any assets. So do you know the largest taxi service in the world? It's Uber. They don't have, they don't own a car, right? Like that was the conversation. Then there is this maturity of the startup ecosystem. You spoke about Y Combinator, right? There was that maturity cycle where it had got to that point where there was good models of how to replicate success. There is the ecosystem of APIs to connect, which you kind of touched on as well, which is you bring in Shopify, a lot of respect on what they ended up doing with just opening up the world to say, here's the APIs, use me the best you can, and also democratizing how you do e-commerce. The barriers to entry for a lot of entrepreneurs got removed at that point, right? You have all of these things. And you started seeing the likes of Warby Parker and whatnot, right? These digital native brands starting to succeed in this space and really make it big. Just a lot of stuff just happened at the right time. Of course, a brilliant idea at the right time, at the right place. That's what makes that business, right? Like that's, of course, brilliant founders, right? That, come together to actually make it happen. So the story resonates as you kind of speak through the timeline and like how that 2014-15 timeframe is so meaningful. Even Dan and I in 2014-15 were exactly looking at those same things and working on the same time. And it's like, it was kind of the wild, wild west for digital native like fulfillment services. And it's evolved quite a lot at this point, but it was a lot of fun time. I also have to say that.
You make a very good point. Yeah. When you look at that period of time, 14, 15, 16, that's when a lot of companies that are today considered the brand names or the catalysts in certain segments of e-commerce services or in e-commerce got their start. People were starting to see this groundswell that was occurring, that, small to mid-size e-commerce, independent merchants was a trend that was growing really, really, really fast. And yeah, it's a really good call out on that period of time. And I would say, yeah, it does take great timing. Timing is so super important. Obviously, brilliant founders, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's as important as just having the grit and the perseverance to keep going. And I think that was, in addition to culture, kind of our secret recipe at ShipBob, is that we just had grit that didn't make any sense. Anybody from the outside looking in wouldn't understand why we kept pressing on the way that we did, why we hustled to solve problems, why we just worked so hard. I mean, nobody was investing in the space back then either. Like, we were on a shoestring budget servicing a very quickly developing market. And I remember when we were doing the Series A process, I think Dhruv and Dave flew to 24, 25 states. Everybody said no from the venture capital community. And we finally found an investor in our backyard here in Chicago with Hyde Park Angels. But it was not a time where supply chain and investing in supply chain solutions was a sexy idea for VC investors. And so you had a lot of companies that were, like you said, Wild West, trying everything, trying really hard to find new solutions and just working through all the problems and the solutions that weren't there. That was a big thing too. There were a lot of solutions that weren't there. So it was up to you and it was up to the team to build solutions, because nobody had charted that path before. Nobody had seen that particular issue before. And it was kind of remarkable that the founding team and the early employees did it themselves. It wasn't until 2018, 2019 where we actually started to bring on experienced logistics professionals with 10, 15, 20 years experience. We kind of just kept hacking it together and moving forward. And that was the great thing about having co-founders and having team members and culture that was super supportive. In any business venture, you're going to fall, and it hurts when you fall. And sometimes the mistakes or the things that happen could be totally gut-wrenching, but having a great founding team, having somebody there to pick you up, to keep going up the hill together, it meant all the difference in the world. And so I have massive respect for solopreneurs, because I don't know how they do it. Without a great team and a support system, I don't know how you build a business, because there's just so many things that go wrong that people never see.
I think that's awesome insight, George. And I know when we were having our prep call, to go back to your intro, right? You talked about being, in the pit, right? And then, those early days of ShipBob too, like we all hear today, $1 billion valuation, unicorn status and all that. But you talk about the synergies that have to happen with the founders, that partnership, going through the good, bad, and the ugly. And you were telling us a story about those early days, right? And how, like, what you did on a daily basis to get this company off the ground. I'd love if you could just share a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have so many stories from being threatened with arrest literally at the post office in Brooklyn, because let me back up for a second. So when we first started ShipBob, I would literally hit the streets of Chicago. I went from working at Goldman Sachs to standing on the street corner with a ship captain's hat on outside the post office, procuring people who would hop out of their cars to go stand 20, 30 minutes in line at the post office. And I would stand out there along with the rest of the team with our iPads and be like, hey, you must be a business owner. You have this big tub of like 20 or so packages. How about we take those off your hands? Sign up for ShipBob. We'll mail these for you. Don't worry. We'll put the labels on it. And tomorrow we'll come by to your office or your store, pick up the packages. All you got to do is we'll integrate your Shopify store, your eBay store, put the packing slips on each of the products. We'll come by, pick it up, bring it back to our little office, and we'll ship it out for you. And I walked literally, in addition to like spending unreasonable amount of time outside post offices, I walked the streets of Chicago, up and down Halsted Street, up and down Milwaukee, up and down Randolph, going to all the antique shows, anywhere where there were small merchants that wanted to ship online or that were shipping online. We would talk with them. and tell them, hey, there's a better way for you to do this. You need to focus on procuring new products, creating new products. We had a lot of Etsy sellers in the early days, a lot of makers. And so, the value proposition or the pitch to them was like, hey, continue to make stuff. Don't worry about this shipping element to your business. We'll take care of that. And slowly but surely, it wasn't like the doors were open from day one. Slowly but surely, people would start to believe in us and start to use us. And thinking back to that period of time and seeing that like small snowball become a bigger snowball and a bigger snowball and a bigger snowball, and then to what it became is almost unreal. But we hustled. We did everything from festivals, street festivals in Chicago, like I said, antique shows. And I literally walked the entire city and went into every little small shop that there is with the pitch that, hey, you are spending how much of your day packaging your online orders in addition to selling your retail orders? Or you have your employee in the back room for 40, 50% of the day packaging your e-commerce orders when they should be on the floor selling. How about working with ShipBob? We'll take care of the shipping element for you. And you can focus on the things that are important to your business that you are natively familiar and good at. And then we went to Brooklyn. And when I opened up our Brooklyn location with our CEO, Drew, at that point, we were still not warehousing products, but what we would do is we dispatch a courier. That courier would, go around the city, do their routes, and just keep bringing packages back to our little office where we would just package the products up on folding tables. But we got to Brooklyn, and it became really clear. We would scrape email addresses off Shopify and email each and every Shopify merchant that we can find and offer to meet them. And what I found out in Brooklyn as I was meeting merchants, Etsy merchants, Shopify merchants, eBay merchants, was a lot of these people had jobs, were running their business as a side hustle. Oftentimes, they would run these out of their home. All the time, they were running them out of their homes because they usually couldn't afford offices. And if they did, it was at like the Navy Yards, and it was like a small room or something like that, or an industry city. But what they would tell me was, I don't know about your couriers coming around every day. I'm in and out. So scheduling a time is inconvenient for me. But I'll tell you what, George, if you can take the inventory out of my living room or out of my garage and save my marriage or save my relationship, I will give you all of my business. And for us, that was like the light bulb moment where we can get more orders if we actually warehouse the goods. And so I distinctly remember going back. It was like a Saturday night in Drew in our little Brooklyn office, which had previously been a New York Mafia social club where we had found I'm totally getting off track, but our first office in Brooklyn, nobody had told us. Drew and I had parked ourselves in Brooklyn for a couple of months, and we had met everywhere from Williamsburg, every place in New York that you could possibly go. We just couldn't figure out a good space, good real estate where we could start our operations in New York. And then finally, we found a space that was on the pricier side in a neighborhood called Red Hook, Carroll Gardens Red Hook in Brooklyn. And everything seemed okay. It was kind of really nice neighborhood, but it was next to a large industrial corridor of Brooklyn. And we moved in. It had, first month or so, we actually lived in the fulfillment center, which wasn't a fulfillment center at the time. It was an office/fulfillment center. So Drew and I slept on air mattresses. And then we finally got an apartment 2 doors down. But my first day that we lived in this place and worked in this place in Brooklyn, the address was 57 Rapley. I took a walk around the block, and there was this husband and wife. And the husband was this guy. He was in a wheelchair, and he's kind of like the mayor of the neighborhood. Everybody knows him. Everybody waves to him. And so I stop, I see them, and I introduce myself. And the wife is like, oh no, the husband is like, hey, you're these guys that moved into that place where all those people were killed, right? And I was like, I laugh.
Welcome to the neighborhood.
Yeah, I laugh it off, thinking that he's joking. And then I'm like, and his wife's like, no, really, you guys moved into that place? I was like, wait, you're not joking? And so we found out that it was previously a mob social club in New York where 9 people were assassinated and gunned down a few years before we had moved in there. But the landlord failed to tell us that. It was his family who owned the place, and his family had owned that place for 40 years. And so we didn't necessarily raise any objections. We just put our head down and went to work. and focus on
chances
what
are
we
the
wanted to
guy
focus
was
on.
also connected to the mafia, so you didn't want to go question that guy, right?
I'm not going to comment on that, but chances are the basement floor had more than just concrete underneath.
Yeah.
Oh, that is such the interesting journey and ride, George. So
sorry, Dan, but I just wanted to say that when I met with these merchants, they were like, "Hey, well, that was the moment where we thought like, hey, if we can warehouse goods for these merchants, we'll be able to win more business." And that was the mentality coming out of Y Combinator is prove the concept, prove the model, find the model by servicing merchants. Whatever they need you to do, product market fit. So I remember how scary it was getting an office space that wasn't just like, 1,300 square feet. Dhruv and I went to, at that time, Industry City was like a fairly decrepit part of New York, Brooklyn. And it was like this big complex from like from the late industrial ages. It's like 10 buildings, massive concrete buildings. At that time, it was just junk. It was weird. It was creepy. There were millions of cats around. But I remember like, holy smokes, we're going to do a 14,000 square foot lease. This is insane. Like, how are we ever going to pay for this? How are we ever going to find enough business to fill this place up? But going back to being an entrepreneur, having team members that believe in you and believe in each other and believe in the mission, we filled it up faster than we ever imagined. And pretty soon we were looking for more space. And now today, Industry City is some of the most desirable real estate in New York. But back then, it certainly was not.
Love that story, George. So we're going to fast forward to 2021. 2021, I think, might have been the year that ShipBob, raised and got the unicorn status and the $1 billion valuation. And as someone who's started a few companies as well, I could only imagine the endless hours you spent contemplating the decision to embark on another journey. And as I've gotten to know you, I think I know your why and the why that occurred, but wanted to have you share what drove you to that decision point. And I believe that's the genesis of your new company, Manifest, but would love to hear what sparked you to say, hey, I'm going to do this all over again.
Yeah, it wasn't automatic. I knew how hard it was to start a company from scratch. It's very hard. And you guys know this better than anyone. But one of the things that became very apparent to me is during COVID was that COVID shaped a new logistics landscape. We now had a world where my 71-year-old mother was very comfortable ordering everything that she gets, everything from groceries to whatever she might need from online, ordering or from the store. And now she was ordering it online. And volumes, as you both know, spiked massively during COVID. And it became very apparent that e-commerce was a part, not only just a growing part of how we shopped, but was going to be basically how we shopped. Retail is still going to have its place, but for now, for that period of time, e-commerce was it. Every company that was selling any product was figuring out how to be online and how to have an e-commerce storefront. That was a fantastic thing. And as a company, we at ShipBob, we were awesomely positioned to take advantage of that and to service merchants and keep their businesses up and running during the trials and tribulations that occurred during the early part of COVID. But I distinctly remember walking through our facility during Thanksgiving of 2020 and looking around the entire facility and how busy we were and how stacked it was with inventory. And I think this was like a 100,000 square foot facility, 110,000 square foot facility, and it was absolutely jammed. And I had this realization that everything in here, whatever timeline you pick, it could be 6 months, it could be 1 year, it could be 2 years, everything is going straight to the trash. Products, some people will buy a product, use it for 3 months, other people will use it for 3 years, but packaging, plastics, products, all the materials, void fill, everything is going to the trash. And this is just one microscopic snapshot of the global view of what e-commerce looks like around the world. I had a sinking feeling that hey, there has to be a better way. There is a better way to do this. I got inspired after that sinking feeling. I got pretty inspired pretty quickly and say, hey, well, I've been on the front lines of e-commerce for 10 years. At ShipBob, we're focused on a different value proposition. We infused tech. We created a platform that leveled the playing field between small and mid-sized e-commerce merchants and larger e-commerce merchants. Their mission is not sustainability, and that's okay. They proved themselves where they were focusing on. But sustainability for the planet, for our legacies, the legacies of this generation, and how we're perceived by future historians when they look back and say, hey, this e-commerce explosion of the early 21st century was fantastic for the economy, for regular people who could start businesses. But at what expense was it? And when I looked around e-commerce, so much had changed over the last 5 or 10 years. So many new innovations had happened, but we were still doing packaging and fulfillment the same way that it was done 25 years ago, 20 years ago. So I was like, okay, it's time for a reimagination, a better solution. There's so many harmful materials that go into this process that can be substituted or innovated out of the equation. It's time to create that. And I couldn't sit idly by and say, hey, someone else will do it, because I knew that we were uniquely positioned to do it.
Just staying on that particular subject, right? So what does sustainable fulfillment to you mean, right? Like, starting from a value chain standpoint, like I look at from procurement to receiving to how you store your products to the facility, the lighting that goes into it, the temperature that you utilize within the facilities, to how you ship, to the corrugate that you utilize, to what you do with the returns, etc. Like, there is so much, right? And of course, the delivery methods that you choose at the end as well, right? Like, what is sustainable fulfillment? Like, what are the low-hanging fruits that can be really quickly hit, right? Like, anyone that's listening to this podcast is thinking about, how do I become sustainable? Of course, there is a business to be run as well at the same time, right? What are the low-hanging fruits? And then what's kind of that long tail that needs to get addressed to get to that point where either you go carbon neutral or you start reversing?
Yeah, it's a great question, Anand, and you hit it on the head. There are so many variables involved in sustainability. And sustainability just isn't limited to being earth-friendly or regenerative, at least for us. Sustainability incorporates environmental, social, and corporate governance factors, but also the data providing these e-commerce merchants the ability to understand what impact their business is making by making the choice to be sustainable, and then being able to communicate that to their audience and their respective customers is what we're hoping to achieve, creating education and awareness around why choosing sustainable products, sustainable fulfillment, environmentally friendly initiatives is the choice that has to happen. It's actually not the right thing to do or the wrong thing. It's very clearly the right thing to do, but it's something that has to happen. And one of the early motivations for doing this business now versus taking 6 months off or 18 months off and then revisiting it a year was that we kept hearing that, Amazon or some such company is going to be carbon neutral by 2035 or 2040. And the more I dig deep into the negative impact that fulfillment has, and fulfillment is a great thing. I'm not knocking fulfillment. Fulfillment is my life. But the elements like plastic tape that's always used, basically commonly used worldwide to package products, the compounds in that tape can take up to 500 years to completely dissolve and biodegrade. That, to me, when I learned that, was insane. Because it's like, when you think about the history of the United States and how long we've been a country, that's almost twice the amount of time that the United States has been a country. And yet that one single package carrying that, fantastic bottle of tea tree oil that you received is going to be hanging around the planet for another half millennium. And it just, to me, it blew my mind. And so action needed to be taken, in my opinion. My team and I my two co-founders are also ShipBob early employees and early team members. We were in a unique position in that we had frontline experience as to how fulfillment works. I had opened and operationalized 5 fulfillment centers. Max had operated our flagship fulfillment center in Chicago. Bob had operated our West Coast facility at ShipBob. And so there weren't many people like us that were willing to take on a big problem and go after a big problem with a big solution. And if there were people like that, they're usually hanging out in Florida or North Carolina thinking about the house in Myrtle Beach and the golf course rather than starting a new business. And so we knew that not only did we think that this was an exciting problem to tackle, but we also felt a sense of responsibility that Let's reimagine how to do this a better way, because it's going to be such an essential part of the 21st, at least the next 20 years. Who knows what happens after that, but at least the next 20 years of the 21st century is going to be e-commerce, is going to be at the forefront of any sort of business that happens worldwide. Let's show people that there's a better way. Let's create a groundswell. Let's get people on the right side of solving this problem. And that's one of the really cool things about why 3PLs can make a big impact, is because as an aggregator of dozens or hundreds or thousands of small businesses, we're able to affect a larger group touch a lot. Each of our merchants has their own audience. And so by aggregating hundreds and thousands of merchants together, getting everybody on the same page as sustainability being not only just the right thing to do, but a competitive advantage for your business, creates a groundswell. And so we're not waiting for the government to say, hey, you have to be sustainable or you have to adhere to these environmental standards. We're not waiting for that. That's going to happen. And they're at least going to try that, but we don't believe in that. We just feel like, hey, this is the right thing to do. We can create a world-class fulfillment solution while doing it in a way that is sustainable. And thus, let's just get to it. Let's start introducing merchants to this concept and this value proposition.
So it'd be awesome, George, if you could give the audience a couple little nuggets of advice of how to tackle some of these things. You mentioned plastic tape. Like, what alternatives have you found that have the least amount of impact on Earth?
Yeah, so early on, one of the first things I started doing when I left ShipBob was just calling around packaging companies, supplies companies all over the world. I literally had calls from South Korea to South Carolina trying to procure packaging that was not only sustainable in concept, but would hold up in the course of a shipment of being delivered and was actually biodegradable and would not, for example, our poly mailers, which we've worked really hard to procure, they biodegrade in about 350 days or so. The traditional poly mailer, for example, will take 23 to 25 years to biodegrade. That gets thrown in the dumpsters and ends up in the oceans. And it is ending up in the oceans because, as you guys know, China has refused to stop taking our used packaging anymore. All of Southeast Asia, where traditionally countries were open to taking the used packaging from North America and the rest of the world, they're no longer doing it. So the only place where they're finding space is to dump this stuff all in the oceans. And that's a huge problem as well. So finding truly biodegradable packaging that can hold up during a transit of a shipment was super important to us. And I stress tested so many different materials. There was hemp poly mailers and these types of void fill. And sometimes they would come back during test shipments where we would send to ourselves looking like somebody had shot machine guns through it. The products were not all there up to speed, but where we did land on was Atlantic Packaging, the New Earth Project, which is an initiative started by Wes Carter, who's the grandson of the founder of Atlantic Packaging. There's also Don Meek and Caroline James, who's their chief sustainability officer. There was a company in terms of that could offer us basically a large portion of our packaging needs that was not only able to provide super high quality product that was sustainable, but their ethos was very much aligned with what Manifest is doing and the pursuit, and aligned with the pursuit that we have of embedding sustainability into e-commerce. There's a fantastic company as well. I think they're based in Portland, Eco Packables, run by this gentleman named Shervin. They have fantastic poly mailers that we use. And we've even explored, for example, reusable packaging. Fantastic company called Lime Loop. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. Ashley Etling is the CEO, but they've created packaging that you put the product in it, you ship it out to the customer, and eventually that customer ships it back to you, and you reuse it, and you can reuse it like 240 times before you have to replace it. So there's a kind of like what you were talking about earlier, Nanad, how 2014, 2015, 2016 was like the Wild West of the early e-commerce services days. We're a little bit in that same space right now when it comes to figuring out what are the best sustainability practices, what are the best materials, what are the best solutions. Is it biodegradable packaging? Is it reusable packaging? We're all kind of trying everything and see what works best, what's going to be most cost effective, what's going to be most durable, what's going to be most appealing. And then while that's happening, simultaneously, you're working on the education part, educating the market, educating merchants, educating the e-commerce community, why we have a unique opportunity to create a paradigm shift in one of the biggest industries in the world. And the reason that is because you both know the space very well. Most e-commerce merchants aren't big bureaucracies. They're a solopreneur or a team of 2 or 3 founders and maybe a handful of employees. So to actually sell them on the idea as to why this is not only a great fulfillment solution and an opportunity to use your business to do good. And so it's not like trying to sell a Fortune 5000 company to go sustainable. We can make a big impact in our particular industry because the red tape to making decisions isn't as long tail as it is in other industries.
And maybe on that front, George, I don't know if there's a misconception in the market, but when we hear of sustainability practices, it obviously, or at least we think it comes at a large cost, right? We think, okay, if we're going to go sustainable, if we're going to do what's good for planet Earth, there is a cost to do that because the other path is the easy button, right? It's not paying attention to it, not having a focus. So when you're building Manifest and you obviously have ShipBob as your benchmark and everything you know about the industry, if I'm a brand or a retailer and I'm thinking about this, I think it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective, like what is the additional cost to incorporate this into your business, right? Am I going to pay an extra 20% for services? Am I going to pay an extra 90% for services? I think it'd be very interesting for the audience to hear what's the reality to incorporate this into your business. And you know, again, it's the right thing to do, but what's the lift to do it?
Yeah, the lift is shared. And it's a fantastic question, Dan. There is obviously a cost to utilizing a better alternative to do things differently than the way that they have been done and that the way that they're being manufactured at scale. When I was having these conversations from South Korea to South Carolina, a lot of the packaging companies told me that it's actually not more money to produce the sustainable packaging, but because everyone just asks for the same things that they've always asked for, the manufacturing is more expensive. It's cheaper for like the traditional goods because it's just manufactured in much higher volumes. But if you actually scale it out on a longer timeline, the costs aren't that different over the long run. In the short term, yes, there's a difference, but we're uncompromising about that. We started this business not just to be a 3PL, but to create a movement within e-commerce to embed sustainability into our industry because we really do believe there's an opportunity there. All of the merchants that have come on board and joined Manifest and have partnered with us on fulfillment have come from major fulfillment companies. And at the end of the day, we know no one's going to work with us if our costs are going to be significantly higher or higher than the traditional 3PL. As a business owner, and I don't blame you for it, you have to do what's right for your business, provide for the livelihood of yourselves, your family, and your employees. And if that is getting another 5-10% on your margin, I understand that. I'm not going to ever criticize somebody for that. So we knew that we had to be cost competitive. And so the answer wasn't, okay, well, we're going to pass on the cost to the merchant because we wouldn't get anywhere. We couldn't just be siloed off the granola of fulfillment company and just wait for people who just are very, very, very passionate because we wouldn't achieve much scale. Like I said, as a business, Manifest is uncompromising about sustainability practices, principles through and through in our company. And if we have to take lower margins, that's what we do. Our stakeholders are on board, our shareholders are on board, because the thinking is if we create change and we create a world-class fulfillment value proposition and we successfully merge that with sustainable principles that businesses understand and know and can communicate to their own audience about the impact, the positive impact that their business is making, in the long tail, the margins will take care of themselves. So one of the things that we successfully did at ShipBob was we introduced like sexy SaaS margins into an industry that traditionally had, 12, 15% fulfillment margins across the board. But then we were able to create a new product mix and package it in a way that we were able to get higher margins, in the 30s and 40%. But initially it wasn't that way. We had bet on the long tail development of those margins. And it's very similar with Manifest. In the short term, we're going to maybe take less margins than what the rest of the players in the industry are currently achieving. And that's okay with us, and it's okay with our shareholders, because I think the disruption is impactful enough to create a long tail effect where merchants are going to find our value proposition a competitive advantage for their business.
Absolutely. And I, just wanted to add, there is other opportunities to save as well. Like one of the numbers just heard yesterday was 40% of all parcels that are shipped, because fulfillment is the one that's packing the parcel, even though it's part of the delivery process. 40% of all parcels being shipped are air, right? Like,
oh, yeah.
Or the amount of shipment that goes out with just air that we are, carrying from one location to another, the carbon footprint, because there is limited capacity of cubic storage that trailer can have, an airplane can have, a truck can have. Now you are riding with 40% air in that trailer, airplane, truck at the same time, right? So there is opportunities with better fulfillment. You could actually cut that out.
Absolutely. And that's going to be one of the more interesting developments over the next 3 to 5 years is that how are we leveraging technology, new investment, because now there's a lot of attention on the supply chain space. How do we leverage the new capital that's coming into the space, technological developments to solve that problem? We've all had that experience where we order, like I reference, a pen or a tea tree oil, and it comes in a box that's 8 times the size and it's got a bunch of pillows in there. And you're like, why did they do this? That's a common occurrence and something that needs to be solved. We can talk about sustainability. We can talk about environmentally friendly. We can talk about regenerative, but nothing beats common sense and figuring out ways how to keep up with mass fulfillment, high velocity fulfillment, but also do it in a way that is packaging efficiency is going to move mountains in terms of how sustainable we are as an industry in e-commerce.
Absolutely.
George, thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. Please share with the audience where they could find you on social, the best way to follow you, and more importantly, where they could learn more about Manifest and your journey in sustainability.
Thanks, Dan. I love having conversations with everybody that has questions around sustainability, e-commerce, or just general curiosity on the topics that I love to talk about and I love to learn about and continue to educate myself. I can be reached. My email address is george@manifest.eco. My LinkedIn, I have a LinkedIn profile as well, and my Twitter is @Wojcki, WOJSKIG.
Amazing. Thank you so much, George.
Thank you very much, George. It was a phenomenal conversation.
Thank you, Ninad. Thank you, Dan. This was a lot of fun.
Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to maximize your supply chain. Available on all major podcasting channels. Thank you for listening and see you in the next episode.